Today I'm going to show you how to paint a mossy rock using gouache. If you want to use this exact rock shape, I'll put a link below in the description to my blog. There you can find a photo of the sketch. You can also find the supplies and colors that I'm using on that blog post. Our first step is going to be the background wash. This is going to be pretty light and transparent. I'm going to use a little bit of white and black. We could add some yellow or brown or both. That changes the color just a little bit, just so that it's not pure gray, it has a little bit of life to it. And I'm just going to paint over everything. So don't worry right now about, on the sketch we've got the moss, don't worry about that. So we're just gonna completely fill that in. I do have my sketchbook propped up a little bit. Gravity is gonna help the paint flow downward. Or you can just put anything under there or even hold it up, but it's more comfortable if you can just set it onto something. While that's wet, I'm gonna take a little bit more black and maybe some brown as well, just to give it a little warmth. And while it's wet, I'm gonna drop in some random spots. And you can see how it is flowing downward. So now I'm just going to kind of swoosh these around a little bit. And this is only to give some texture to the rock and kind of make it look a bit aged and add some interest to it. This isn't necessarily shading, though you can put more of these in the darker area if you want. So now I'm gonna take some green, just like a mid-tone green, and I'm gonna add some brown to it. I want it to be a very earthy green. And I'm gonna go on the bottom here and just paint a little strip of grass. And I'm just doing this to get a very soft transition between the rock and the grass. And if we want, we can do a couple little flicks here just to make it look grassy. But there's gonna be more layers where we get into those details, so you don't have to go too far with that here. Just a little grassy texture down there. The way I've divided the steps is every time that I need to dry the painting, that's a new step. Usually I will use a hairdryer to dry the painting real quick, half a minute or so, and you're ready to go on. So the next layer is gonna be adding some shadows and detail onto the rock. So we're working on values, we're gonna darken some areas, we're gonna give texture. I like to use some dry brushing for this, so let me show you. I'm gonna go right into this mix we've been using here. We've got some white and black, so we've got a darker gray, and I'm gonna bring in some more brown. Still layering pretty transparent. It's normal to layer gouache thin to thick. Lately, I've been leaning a little bit more into watercolor techniques with it. You can always paint with a more thick mix of paint if that's what you prefer. So figuring out where to put your shadows, think about where you want the light to come from. In this situation, I'm gonna imagine the sun is coming, this way. So the shadows are gonna be more on this side of the rock, with the top being in light and maybe the left side being a little lighter too, if anything. So we've got this gray, and I'm gonna start here and just pull down. So that's a little too wet to do dry brushing, so I'm just gonna dry my brush on the rag, and then we can continue. Yeah, and so you can see these kind of textures, and that's pretty cool. And I'm just gonna wet my brush now. And there's enough paint already on the paper that I could even just use pretty much clean water here, and the paint that's on the paper is gonna flow into those areas. And I think it's nice because it creates like these different textures, areas that are darker and areas that are lighter. As you can see, I'm not worried about where the moss is gonna go. That's another thing, we're painting so light here, and we can paint opaquely on top of it, so we're gonna be able to put that wherever we want in the next layer. Okay, and then over here, we're gonna do the same thing. I like to get that soft blend down at the bottom, so I'll just go ahead and add another layer of green just so that we can have that gradient. While this is wet, we can add some more depth wherever you decide you want it. So this is kind of like the same thing as the layer one. Once you've got a wet area, you can drop more paint down into it. This is completely up to your discretion, what you think looks cool. You can also add different colors here. I'm trying to keep the palette pretty minimal so that it makes more sense following along, but you can add like blues and reds. You can get all kinds of interesting colors going on there. One more thing I want to do on this step, we are going to darken the light area of the rock just a little bit, and we are going to use dry brushing for that. So we're going to take the white and let's add some yellow, maybe some brown. Do we like that? I feel like I got too yellow. It's always a good idea to use a test sheet rather than going right on the painting if you're not sure. Too dark. All right, I think I like that. We're gonna do some dry brushing with this color at the top. This is kind of an optional step. I mean, it doesn't change all that much from what I originally had up there. By darkening this a little bit, not only is this adding some texture, but it also gives us the ability to add highlights in later and really accentuate some areas. If the background wash is too light, then you can't really do that. So you could also have gone in with a little bit of a darker background wash. I don't mind that we get some messy stuff. I think especially when you're painting something gritty like rocks, it just adds to the cool textures and grittiness of them. So I might even take some of this gray and, you know, purposely add a little bit of that up here. A lot of this area is gonna have moss on it, so it's okay to experiment. Step 2 is thoroughly dry, so we can go on to the next step, which is going to be adding the moss layer. So we've got a light green and a medium green, and I want this moss to be very earthy, so I'm going to add some brown to that. This is just a burnt umber, some yellow, and let's try this. So this area, it got a little hard to see my sketch, but I do remember what I had in mind. I've got a little photo of my sketch, so I'm following along with that. So I had initially covered this whole area. It's tempting to leave that just because some cool textural things happened. I want to stay true to the sketch so that when you're following along, it makes sense. When you make some of these dry brushing strokes, sometimes you're gonna get really cool stuff and sometimes you'll get stuff you don't like as much. So when I'm adding moss or things like that, I'll purposely cover up areas or decide to leave areas showing depending on what went well in the previous step. So if you've got some really cool rock textures, you know, don't cover them up. Okay, and then the little rock. I might leave a little bit more of the rock showing on this one, that texture, I like it. And then over here. So I'm gonna add a tiny bit of shading to this moss, not too much, but I have this dark green over here. Might even use some black. And just drop some of that in on the right side, and also anything below this like lip here. Kind of makes sense to make that a little darker. And so you don't have to make the whole thing dark. You can add little patches. It's cool to also get, you know, some texture and stuff going maybe. Do something like that. And even up here, there's a couple spots where it might make sense. And we'll just softly blend that down into the grass. Okay, that was step 3. Let's dry it. We have 2 steps left. The next step, we're gonna do one more step of deepening shadows, then we're gonna dry things up, and then we're gonna do some detailing. For shadows, I'm specifically talking about the rock. We've got this black here, and I am gonna add some brown, and you can even add some green to this. You know, there's gotta be a lot of bounce light going around here, a lot of green from the grass and the moss and everything. Where should we add these shadows? We wanna remember the lighting situation around here, and maybe in between the 2 rocks, it might get a bit dark there. Let's start there. And you can always start dark and then water down your paint a little bit, or get some clean water and then kind of blend it in more subtly. You can also continue with dry brushing and those kind of textures. If anything you do you don't like maybe that was a little dark, you can take a tissue, paper towel, whatever you have, and push down and pull that up. If you really don't like it, you can add some more clean water to that, then push down and pull it up. To me, this is all a little too solid, so I kind of want to add some more of these little drops just to make it more interesting and let there be some lighter and darker areas within that shadow. I like a little variation if possible. Textures, gritty rocks. Over here, even though it's on the lighter side, it still makes sense that on this slightly downward facing angle, there would be some shadow and maybe some more green bounce light. Maybe we could go that a little further with the green on this side. I think I like that. Maybe I'll add some more green here too. I'm gonna go one more time with a grassy color just to keep going with those transitions here. Gotta make sure that I tone down this blue-green or it's gonna really stand out. That's the Holbein dark green. Yeah, I really like that color, but it's a little on the cool side. It's got a lot of blue in it, so. So I'm just bringing some grasses up in front of the rock here in a couple places. I probably shouldn't get too carried away with that because that's going to be in our next step. I'm really trying to keep these steps divided cleanly, so I'll stop there. So now we're going to begin with the detailing layer, which is always a fun part of the process. I'm using a small brush and I'm going to be starting with the rock and adding little cracks and things. So we're going to go again with this dark brown gray color. And where do we want to put cracks? That is completely up to our imagination. Sometimes I like to just see where there have already been little things forming because of the water moving around and kind of doing its own thing, and then use that. So here I'm seeing like sort of a possibility for something like that. So kind of lean into stuff that's already happening, and you don't need to go too far with this. In fact, maybe your rock doesn't have any cracks in it. Maybe your rock's in very good shape. I do think they're fun. Here I'm using a slightly lighter color because this area is light, so if I went with a really dark crack, it would be maybe too much contrast. I also want to use this kind of mid-gray to add some shadows here. Maybe the moss would cause a little shadow. Dragging down with the brush, doing some dry brushing, like streak effects. That one was a little darker than I expected. There's a kind of sharpening effect that I like to do around the outside edge of the rock with a dark gray. It's like a little shadow has been caused by a tiny little chip out of the rock. These can be a little scary to add because they can be maybe too bold sometimes. You have to be careful and just kind of keep them minimal. But a couple little chips like that, it really brings things into focus. Let's move on to the moss. I'm gonna use this lighter green. We could also add a little bit of white to it. Maybe give a little bit of a moss texture. So some tiny little dabs of paint like going out, kind of little hairs, little mossy hairs. I'm kind of flaring them out and trying to think about them like with grasses, how when the wind blows grasses, you get those kind of waves. So I'm kind of trying to think about it like that too, just because I think that's a pretty effect and a way to sort of organize it. Let's make a larger shape there. I also want to add some of that light down here and on this little one. And again, I want to break up that really neat silhouette by just having a couple of these little hairs stick out. Now that is a preference. There's different kinds of moss, and some of them are kind of thin the way they cover a rock, and then it'll be pretty smooth, and others are more thick and fuzzy looking. So we're kind of going for a more thick, fuzzy one here. Anywhere that you have a transition from one value to another, like here we have this hard edge, that's a place where you can put some texture and it'll stand out. So I don't only want to add details to the light area, we are going to add some in the shadows too. So let's get a darker green. And down here, for example, I'm going to add some shading and also those little hairs. Give some more dimension to it by adding a shadow right at that edge there. And we can do the same thing up here. Another thing I want to do is add some little leaves, little grasses and things. This part can also be a little scary, but I'm just gonna go for it. So just some cute little grasses, little plants. You can add some leaves if you want. I also like to just add some random dots. This is not very scientific, but it's just for texture. We're painting moss. If you look at some reference pictures, it's got all these different shades and different textures and thicknesses that cause some cool effects. And I think letting the paint do some of that for you can make things a lot easier. I'm gonna do a plant coming out from behind this little one. And then I'm just gonna do some leafy stuff. I love painting plants. I've got a video on leaf shapes if you need any help with that. I'll link that one too. And then we're gonna start with grasses here. I'm gonna try to keep these pretty large. I also have another brush here. Sometimes I do this. I have two brushes. I'll use one with a paint and then one brush I'll keep with like a clean water and kind of go through and blur some things as I go. So painting and blurring a little bit because I want it to be, you know, some areas I want to be crisp and some areas I want it to be soft. So here we're gonna have some grasses coming up in front of the rocks. That should help them feel more in the environment to actually have some grass in front. So I want to make a different plant up here. So I'm going to use the mid green and then I might do some lighter leaves. So I have to be careful I don't put my hand into the wet spot. Let's see. Am I covering the view completely? I know that occasionally my hand is blocking, so I'm gonna try to paint where you can see here. It's looking a little too like coming right out of that rock. It's very silly. So I'm gonna try to add some more stuff to just make it look more lush over here and make that less obvious, hopefully. I'm adding some lighter colored grasses because we said the sunlight was coming this way. I think it looks a little better now with more going on over there. Maybe just a couple little leaves. Okay, so now we're gonna add some grasses that are a little bit lighter, a little bit opaque. This is just so that we can get some layering and some grasses that are lighter, some that are catching the light here. And maybe we can even do some little plants, some cute little plants. And this part, you could add some flowers if you want. I think that's fun. It's completely up to you. If we were gonna add a couple flowers, maybe there's an area here because it's kind of dark that some lighter flowers would stand out. So let's try this. I'm just gonna add a couple quick flowers. When I'm adding something like this, I try to add uneven numbers, 3, 5 or so. It can look like a more natural grouping somehow. Let's add stems on these, just a little bit. Sometimes all it takes is just kind of doing a little downward stroke just so you can see the direction it's going in and it can kind of fade away. And let's get that lighter yellow. I hadn't planned adding flowers in the beginning, but I hope they're working out okay. You guys can let me know what you think, if you like the flowers or not. One last thing that I do is add highlights onto the rock. And I feel like this one doesn't necessarily need it because I reserved some here and that worked out okay, but it doesn't always. Sometimes I want to add stuff back in, so I'll show you how I do that just in case. So I'm going to use a white. We just want to make a little bit of an off-white with some of the warm colors here. It's nearly white. And then you're going to decide where you want to add more highlights. You can focus these little highlights on edges too, like this corner, edges and corners. The light's coming from this way, so this area should be pretty light, I think that's better. This area here, right at the base where the rock is sitting into the grass, sometimes it's nice to add a tiny bit more of a dark green to make it really feel like it's sitting down in there. There's these dark areas and shadows. So I'm using a lot of water. This is gonna add some texture too. But you can come down here and in a couple places kind of add little dots. And then I'm drying off my brush and we can like make them a little streaky, blend it in a little. So as it dries, you can see, is it working? Is it too much? And then you can adjust. But I think it's helping, especially over here. I think that makes a lot more sense value-wise. This is sort of a negative painting, painting the negative space in between the grasses instead of painting the grasses themselves. And that can be very pretty. That brings us to the end of the painting. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any requests of things you'd like me to paint in the future, just let me know in the comments and I will definitely keep them in mind. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.